There was a city in the ancient world that no cartographer of our era can locate on any map, and no archaeologist has ever pressed a trowel into its soil. Its name does not appear in the chronicles of Rome or in the merchant records of Babylon. It is not carved into the walls of any excavated temple. And yet the accounts that have survived it, the testimonies of those who walked its streets and stood inside its gates, describe something so extraordinary, so wholly unlike anything else ever built by human hands, that to read them carefully is to feel the absence of that city as a kind of wound. The city was called Velundara, and the story of what it was, what it became, and what it meant is among the most devastating and beautiful stories ever preserved about what happens when God decides to dwell in a place. The story does not begin with architecture. It does not begin with wealth, or with the ambitions of a king who wanted to build something magnificent enough to outlast his own name. It begins with a generation of people who had come through something catastrophic, a long season of scattering and grief, of living in places that were never truly theirs, of sleeping in the shadow of other nations' gods. They had carried their faith like a coal pressed inside the chest, small and close and desperately protected. And when they arrived in the valley between the two rivers, where Velundara would eventually rise, they did not begin by quarrying stone. They built an altar first. That detail matters. It is the first thing the records say. An altar before a dwelling. A place for God before a place for themselves. I find it difficult to overstate what that choice represents. There is a posture visible in that act, a deliberate ordering of priorities that Scripture regards as the beginning of all genuine wisdom. These were not people performing religious ritual as a cultural habit. They were people who understood, with the kind of understanding that only suffering produces, that a city without the presence of God is not a city at all. It is an arrangement of stones. It is a market with walls around it. And they wanted something other than that. They wanted something they had never had before, a place where the presence of the Lord was not a memory or a promise deferred, but an actual, daily, inhabiting reality. They built the altar, and then, the accounts say, they waited. What came next is the part that no historian of a purely secular temperament will find satisfying, because it cannot be explained by trade winds or soil quality or the strategic advantage of a river junction. A fire appeared on the altar that no human hand had lit. This is what the oldest testimony records, written in a hand that scholars have dated to within 2 generations of the founding. The fire appeared. It did not flicker and go out. It burned. And the people who saw it fell on their faces in the dust of the valley and understood, in that moment, that they had not simply chosen a location. They had been chosen for one. The city that grew from that altar was unlike anything built before it. I do not mean that as a general compliment, the kind of language used about cities that had impressive walls or clever drainage systems. I mean it in a specific, documentable, almost uncomfortable sense. Velundara was designed around the altar as all other cities are designed around a marketplace or a palace. Every road in the city led toward the high place at its center. Every gate was positioned so that a person entering from any direction would have an unobstructed view of the altar fires burning on the hill. The architects who drew the city's plan were not, by any account, the most technically sophisticated builders of their era. They had no special advantage in engineering. What they had was a conviction so total that it shaped every measurement. The city must be legible as devotion. Every stone must declare the same thing. And because of that, God stayed. This is the theological claim at the center of every account of Velundara, and I do not soften it or qualify it because the records do not soften or qualify it. The presence of the Lord, the accounts say, rested over that city the way the cloud rested over the tabernacle in the wilderness. Not metaphorically, not as a feeling or an atmosphere. A visible sign, a luminescence that travelers reported seeing from the surrounding hills long before they reached the city walls. A brightness that had no natural explanation and that never moved. Merchants who came to trade in Velundara returned to their own cities and described it the way the Queen of Sheba described Solomon's court. They said that half had not been told them. They said that seeing it changed what they believed was possible. What made Velandara the city it was had almost nothing to do with the things that make cities powerful in the ordinary sense of that word. It had no standing army of exceptional size. It did not sit on the largest trading route of its era. Its walls were substantial, but not the most formidable in the region. What it had was a quality of life that every visitor's account reaches for and then confesses it cannot fully capture. The word that appears most often in the surviving testimonies is the word that translates roughly into English as wholeness, a completeness of experience, a sense that nothing essential was missing. People in Velandara were not simply surviving. They were, by every account, flourishing in a way that the surrounding world could observe but not replicate. The markets of Velandara were, by themselves, worth the journey, not because they were the largest or the most stocked with exotic goods, though they were well supplied. They were extraordinary because of the way commerce was conducted inside them. There was no false measure in Velandara's markets. This is documented not as an aspiration or a posted law, but as an observed practice that astonished foreign merchants who had come from cities where short measure and inflated prices were simply understood to be the way the world worked. In Velandara, a merchant's word was treated as a binding oath, because in that city, every transaction was understood to take place in the sight of the God who inhabited the altar on the hill. Honesty was not a policy. It was a theology made practical, and that theology produced a market that drew buyers from hundreds of miles away, because you could trust what you were buying. The justice of Velandara was spoken of in the same terms. I have read the account of a trader from a northern city who came to Velandara to settle a dispute with a local merchant, expecting the outcome that awaited foreigners in most cities of that era, which was to say, no favorable outcome at all. He received a fair hearing. His claim was examined without prejudice. The judgment went against him on one count and for him on another, and he went home and wrote about it as the most remarkable thing he had witnessed in 40 years of commerce. He said that the judges of Velandara seemed genuinely afraid of something, not of the parties before them, not of the power of wealthy families, but of something else, something invisible, something that he could not name in the language of his own city, but that he felt sitting in that hall. The healing that occurred in Velandara was another matter entirely, and this is where the accounts become the most difficult to evaluate with the tools of ordinary historical analysis. The city had physicians, trained practitioners with genuine skill, but the records describe recoveries that the physicians themselves did not claim credit for. People who arrived in the city carrying diseases that had not responded to any treatment found themselves, after weeks of living in proximity to the altar hill, altered in ways that no medical explanation covered. I am not prepared to tell you exactly what was happening in those cases. I am only prepared to tell you what the records say, and what they say is that Velandara had a reputation as a city where sick people went and sometimes came back well, and that this reputation was old enough and consistent enough to suggest something real was occurring there. The children of Velandara grew up differently. This is one of the quieter observations in the testimonies, but one of the most striking. Visitors remarked on it repeatedly. The quality of the children in that city, not that they were exceptionally beautiful or exceptionally clever, though some accounts mention both. What struck people was the way those children carried themselves, a kind of settled fearlessness, a confidence that had nothing anxious in it. They played in the streets near the altar hill without the furtive watchfulness that children in hard cities develop early. They looked at strangers with open curiosity rather than suspicion. Several accounts describe Velandaran children asking questions of visiting merchants with a frankness and intelligence that left the merchants feeling they had been examined, not the other way around. The music of Velandara deserves its own account, and several people who wrote about the city gave it one. There were singers in that city whose voices visitors claimed to hear in their memories for years afterward. Not because those voices were technically superior to what could be heard elsewhere, but because of what the music was about. Every song in Velandara was, in some sense, oriented toward the altar. Even the songs that were not explicitly religious, the working songs, the harvest songs, The songs sung at celebrations carried inside them a quality that listeners described as brightness, as though the music had been composed by someone who was genuinely happy rather than by someone who merely knew how happiness should sound. That distinction is not a small one. Most music performed for public consumption is a skilled imitation of joy. The music of Velundara, if the accounts are to be believed, was the real thing. The nights in Velundara were, if anything, more remarkable than the days. This requires explanation. In most ancient cities, night was a time of danger, of theft and violence, and the settling of debts that could not be settled publicly. Velundara's nights were calm, not because there were no human failings in that city. There were, the records are honest about that, but because the fire on the altar hill burned through the night and cast a light that reached into the streets below, and that light was understood by everyone living there as more than a physical phenomenon. It was a reminder. Whatever you are about to do, you are doing it in the sight of something that sees everything. That reminder did not make Velundaran people perfect, but it made them, on balance, more careful. And more careful, in a city, is the difference between a place where people flourish and a place where they merely endure. To spend a single night in that city would have been to experience something I suspect no modern arrangement of wealth or comfort can reproduce. I think about what it would mean to walk those streets in the hour before dawn, when the altar fire would be at its steadiest, when the city would be quiet enough that you could hear the distant sound of the singers who kept the night watch on the hill. I think about breathing air that multiple testimonies describe as unusually clean, carrying some quality that visitors could not name but consistently noticed. I think about the feeling of being in a place where the invisible architecture of a community was built around something worthy of that architecture. That is not a feeling most of us have ever had. The absence of it is something we recognize, without knowing what we are missing. There were scholars in Velundara whose writings circulated to cities across the known world of that era. They were not writing theology in the narrow sense, not simply producing instruction about ritual and practice, though some of them did that as well. They were writing about the nature of things, about the relationship between visible and invisible reality, about what a human life is actually for, about the difference between acquiring everything you want and actually possessing anything of lasting value. The language of those writings has a quality that is immediately recognizable to anyone who has spent time in the wisdom literature of Scripture. It is the language of people who have thought seriously about death and have come out the other side of that, thinking not terrified, but clarified. You can feel, reading them, that these were people who knew what mattered because they lived daily in the presence of what actually mattered. The rulers of Velundara were, by consistent account, the least impressive part of the city. I mean that in the best possible sense. They were not the kind of rulers whose personalities dominated the culture around them, whose ambitions bent the lives of ordinary people into shapes that suited the powerful. They governed, the records suggest, with a constant awareness that the city did not belong to them. The altar on the hill preceded every one of them. The fire had been burning before any of their families held authority, and it would, presumably, be burning after. That awareness produced in them a quality of restraint that struck every foreign diplomat who came to negotiate with Velundaran leadership. They were not trying to maximize their own position. They were trying not to be the one who broke something that was not theirs to break. The question that any honest reading of the Velundara accounts eventually produces is the same question that the wisest texts of every tradition eventually produce. Why did it end? Because it did end. Velundara did not persist. The fire on the altar hill did not burn forever. The accounts of the city's dissolution are harder to read than the accounts of its glory. Not because the dissolution was violent, though there was violence in it, but because of the particular nature of what went wrong. It was not an enemy army that broke Velundara. It was not a plague or a flood, or any of the catastrophes that level cities from the outside. What broke Velundara came from within, and anyone who has read Scripture carefully will recognize the pattern immediately, because it is the oldest pattern in the record. The city that had been built by people who put the altar before the dwelling began, across generations, to put other things first. slowly, incrementally, in ways that each individual generation could have defended as reasonable. The altar was still there, the fire was still lit, the rituals were still performed, but the understanding that had animated those rituals, the genuine trembling recognition that the God of the altar was the source of everything Velandara had and was, that understanding softened and then faded. The merchants began to use the false measures that they had once been too afraid to use. The judges began to give more weight to the claims of wealthy families. The music began to sound. The accounts note this with precision, like imitation, like people performing joy rather than feeling it. And then the accounts record something that is, in theological terms, among the most sobering descriptions I have encountered in any document from this period. The brightness above the altar hill diminished. Not suddenly, not dramatically, the way warmth leaves a room when a fire is allowed to go out, so gradually that no single moment marks the change, but undeniably, irreversibly. Visitors who had heard the testimonies of older travelers began to arrive and find a city that was still impressive in its material arrangements, but that had lost the quality no one had ever quite been able to name. The air was still good, the walls were still standing, the markets were still open, but something was gone. And the people of Velandara, having grown up in the diminished version, did not even know to grieve what was missing, because they had never seen the fullness themselves. The final records from Velandara are not triumphant. They are not even particularly dramatic. They describe a city becoming indistinguishable from every other city of its era, a competent arrangement of stone and commerce and competing interests, governed by the usual calculations of power. The altar was still maintained as a historical monument, a point of civic pride, a feature that the city showed to visitors the way other cities showed their old walls or their ancient wells. But no fire burned on it any longer, and no one, by that point, expected one to. The dissolution of Velandara was not the story of a conquered city. It was the story of a city that forgot what it was, and in forgetting, became what it had never been built to be. What I find myself returning to, reading these accounts across many hours, is not the glory of Velandara at its height, though that glory is genuinely extraordinary to contemplate. What I return to is the people who built that altar before they built their houses. I think about what it cost them, that choice, in terms of the immediate comfort they sacrificed to make the theological statement first. They were tired people. They had come through a long scattering. They had every practical reason to build shelter first and worship later. But they understood something that their descendants would slowly forget, that the altar was the source of the shelter, that the presence of God was not an ornament placed on top of a city that had been built by other means. It was the foundation, and you cannot remove a foundation and expect the structure above it to stand. The accounts of Velandara leave me with a particular kind of grief, the grief of something genuinely beautiful that was genuinely lost because people genuinely chose to lose it, not in a single dramatic act of rebellion, but in the long accumulation of small concessions and softened commitments and reasonable-sounding adjustments that, taken together, amounted to the same thing as walking away. I think about the children who grew up in the diminished city and never knew that the streets they played in had once been different, that the air had once carried something extra, that the music had once been real. They could not miss what they had never experienced, and that particular form of loss, the loss you cannot even name because you never possessed the thing you lost, is perhaps the most devastating form of all. The fire on the altar hill of Velandara is gone, but the records of what that fire made possible have survived, and they survive for a reason, not as nostalgia, not as a pleasant fantasy about a city too good to have been real. They survive as testimony, as evidence, as a document of what becomes possible in a place where people genuinely, at cost, with full awareness of what it requires, put the altar before the dwelling. What happens to justice in such a place? What happens to commerce and music, and the quality of children's laughter and the safety of the nights? What the air feels like? What the mornings look like when the fire on the hill is still burning? The testimonies of Velandara are not a comfort. They are a question. And the question is not about an ancient city. The question is about every place where people still have the chance to choose what they will build first.